Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to see you virtually today. My name is Jenny Lin, and I'm Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the Roski School of Art and Design. And on behalf of Dean Haven Linkirk, as well as Suzanne Lacey, Professor of Art and Chair of the Roski Talk Committee, as well as all of our colleagues in USC's Roski School of Art and Design, I am thrilled to welcome you today to this afternoon's second Roski Talk, featuring the fabulous Ruby Lerner. Ruby is the founding director of Creative Capital and a longtime champion for artists, as so many of our colleagues know, who have benefited from the tremendous support of her excellent foundation and of having the pleasure of working with Ruby. Some of our MA students are going to introduce her shortly. So before that, I just wanted to quickly remind you of the upcoming talks that we have for this fantastic series this semester. We will have actually tomorrow, there is a panel event called Black Gay Male that is organized and co-sponsored by USC's Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. And it will feature 4 seminal activist cultural producers discussing the print media they created and circulated in the late 20th century. I think all of you know, since you're here, how to register for the Roski Talks. So please follow that link on the Roski website for upcoming events and check them out. But just as a quick reminder, some of the other exciting events coming up are Cognate Collective on February 17th, our own Keith Mayerson, Professor of Art and Artist, on February 24th, Carmen Winant, who will be giving the Hatman Photography Lecture on March 3rd, TJ Dudu Norris, an artist who will be visiting us, Karen Fong, a designer, coming on March 11th, Diedrich Brackens on March 17th, an artist, Amelia Jones, our very own Professor of Critical Studies and brilliant curator, scholar, and theorist, coming on March 31st, Gabriela Urtiaga, curator at MOLA, joining us on April 14th, and last but not least, Simon Leung, artist and Professor of Art at UC Irvine, joining us on April 21st. So please mark your calendars. Most all of those upcoming talks are Wednesdays at 2, like this one today, unless otherwise noted. So without much further ado, I will hand it over to our fabulous first year master's students who will introduce Ruby. We have Lauren Guilford, our master's student in the program in curatorial practices and public sphere, as well as Hai Wei Ye, who is an MFA student in design. Thank you.
Hi, it's such an honor to introduce Ruby and to have her here today. So Ruby Lerner is the founding executive director of Creative Capital, an innovative arts foundation that adapts venture capital concepts to support individual artists. And under her leadership, Creative Capital committed more than $40 million in financial and advisory support to 511 projects representing 642 artists. And Ruby has a background in performing arts, and prior to Creative Capital, she served as the executive director of the Association of Independent Video and Filmmakers, and as a publisher of Independent Film and Video Monthly. And Ruby is currently working as an advisor to the arts program at the Open Society Foundations, assisting in the design and implementation of the new International Soros Arts Fellowship. And she's also the arts advisor to Civic Hall in New York. And in 2017, she was the inaugural senior policy advisor to the Herberger Institute at Arizona State University and innovator in residence at Cal Arts. And Ruby currently serves on the board of directors of the Andy Warhol Foundation, I-Beam and Light Industry, and serves on many advisory boards, including New Inc. at the New Museum, the Feminist Institute, Space at Writer Farm, and at the Center for Arts Activism, among many others. So that was a lot of information. Ruby, you've done so much. And we just came from a workshop with Ruby that was so inspiring. And so we're so thrilled to have you here and to learn more about Creative Capital. And thank you so much.
I'm so excited to be here. We did just have a 3-hour workshop. I'm so excited by the students themselves as people, but also about the work that they are all proposing. So it's an incredibly exciting class, a couple of classes, and I can't wait to follow their work. So thank you so much, Neo, Suzanne, Anu, for inviting me, and thanks to Sophia for all your help. There are so many people at USC that I feel connected to, including a handful of Creative Capital grantees, a lot of great supporters, and even your president, Carol Folt. I got to know her a bit when she was at UNC Chapel Hill. So it's an honor for me to be with you today. Um, Suzanne mentioned that a number of you in the program are interested in starting your own organizations. I was so thrilled to hear that. And that makes me especially excited to tell you a little bit about Creative Capital's early history. I was its founding director. After about 17 years at the helm, I felt it was time to share this wonderful organization, that is how I thought about it, with new leadership. And so I retired in 2016 to move on to new cultural adventures. I haven't been directly involved since then, so I'm not going to try to represent how it may have changed. Instead, I'm going to talk primarily about the founding ideas and the unique model that we built for supporting artists during my tenure. I'll end with some thoughts about being a successful artist or successful organization in the challenging environment that we're living in. I've titled today Radical Creativity: Why It Matters, What It Takes, Inventing Creative Capital. I'm going to get a little bit more granular than I normally do, so this talk's a little bit longer than I usually talk, because I want to leave you with some information that I hope that you can use as you make your way through your own careers. And if you're thinking about starting your own organizations, those efforts will definitely require granular thinking. All right, the Creative Capital origin story. Creative Capital grew out of conversations that started when the National Endowment for the Arts stopped most of their support to individual artists in the mid to late 90s during what's known as the culture wars. The arts community, especially the artist community, was pretty devastated financially, but especially emotionally. Cutting off support signaled that we had gone from being a country that valued its artists to a country that excoriated them. But this moment was also the height of the dot-com boom, which was energetic and forward-looking and brought about new and experimental approaches in philanthropy, primarily to the social services sector. This was known as social venture philanthropy, or sometimes called high engagement grant making. So it was a complex moment. While government support was disappearing, there was enough excess capital around in the private sector that foundations and individuals could invest in something new without cannibalizing support to their previous commitments. Creative capital was definitely possible because of the good economy of the late 90s, and I always like to try to be sure to say that. And creative capital represented hope in what was a dark time. When these entrepreneurs and venture capitalists started creating their philanthropies and studied what I call the traditional here's a check, send us a report model of giving, they wondered who would do business this way. So they decided to apply the methodologies that they had used to build their often world-changing businesses to address social issues like education, homelessness, criminal justice, literacy, child welfare, healthcare. But no one was applying those concepts in the cultural arena. So creative capital was established as an experiment to see if venture capital approaches could be imported and, of course, adapted to support individual artists. You can only imagine the skepticism. I was engaged toward the end of 1997, and I began my thinking and research at that time. We officially launched in 1999, right at the beginning of the year, under the leadership of the Andy Warhol Foundation and 21 other funders. Arch Gillies, the then president of the foundation, felt that the Warhol Foundation wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for the success of an individual artist, and therefore it was appropriate for the foundation to step up to leadership. During my year of research, I looked at some of the key tenets of venture capital: building a long-term relationship with a business, providing financial support at various points in a business's life, surrounding the business with advice and other non-monetary support, building the internal capacity of the business to thrive long-term, and the expectation of a financial return if the business is successful. And while I did not know doodly squat about venture capital when I took the job, I thought those approaches present a pretty compelling framework for a cultural enterprise. But of course, I also drew on my own experiences. Creative Capital was the fourth nonprofit arts organization I had run, and I was 50 years old, so I had a lot of experience to draw on. The most useful, perhaps, was my experience running Alternate Roots in the early 80s. Some of you may know about Roots. It's a grassroots cultural organization in the South. It was born in 1976 at the Highlander Center, which has been a home for all kinds of progressive movements over many, many decades. Plus, I was really interested in other kinds of organizations and organizational structures like cooperatives and membership organizations like Roots, as well as the mutual aid societies that immigrant communities create when they come to a new country, and the microloan programs created by people like Muhammad Yunus at Grameen Bank. So I took a hyper-capitalist approach, venture capital, and combined it with what I had learned through my years in the nonprofit cultural world, all deeply influenced by the work and mission of progressive community and political organizations. My goal was for Creative Capital to be a hybrid, a kind of postmodern mashup, somewhere between a traditional grant-making organization and an artist service organization, with both of those activities kind of glued together by an entrepreneurial sensibility. I kind of perversely liked that the VC language confused people. I was at a small dinner in the early years of Creative Capital, and I was talking to a historian about what we were trying to do. And he said, wow, that's so subversive. And I said, well, I certainly hope so. I started thinking about the idea of radical creativity, the value of radical beauty, radical delight, or radical provocation in shaking us out of our expectations. I love the title of one of the theater critic John Lahr's books, Astonish Me. And that was a directive that we actually gave to our selection panelists. I'm not sure I can precisely define radical creativity, but I like saying the word radical because I think, most people are a little afraid of it. And it means so many great things. Arising or going to a root or source, departing markedly from the usual or customary, and relating to or advocating fundamental changes in current practices, conditions, or institutions. My dream was that we would support radically inventive artists and do that in a radically inventive way. Perhaps most important, we began with an understanding that to support the kind of creativity that moves society forward, whether that's in business, science, or the arts, some entities must be as willing to take risks on the innovators as the innovators themselves take in building their enterprises. While this need for risk-taking is pretty well understood in those other realms, it has not always been so well understood in the arts. And we were continually asking, what will make someone stronger than when they leave us, than when they came in? What does someone need in order to be resilient? My hope was to create an organization that didn't just support groundbreaking artistic work, but that would create the conditions for artists to have agency in their artistic and personal lives for years to come. So we put the venture capital methodology to work, but of course, with very different underlying values. Something we committed to early on was the idea of a longer term commitment to an artist than the typical 12 to 18 month award period. Venture capitalists know that 12 to 18 months might not be enough time to realize a potentially powerful idea. We expected to work with artist projects for 3 to 5 years, some cases even longer. Many of the artists said that the freedom of time made them more ambitious for their work. And we learned something really important, that time was as important in the equation as the money and services were, something, again, that's not always appreciated by arts philanthropists. We envisioned a comprehensive 4-part system of support that is integrated, multifaceted, and sequential, and truly practical. I'm not very ideological, I'm kind of practical. The 4 components are support the project, support the person, nurture the community, and engage the public. We supported the project through money, mentorship, meetings. The total amount of the award was $50,000. Financial support was a key area where I felt venture capital concepts might be kind of useful, rethinking how money flowed through a project's life. Venture capitalists look for benchmarks when determining continued investments. And I thought, while our benchmarks would be quite different, it might be helpful to look at the anatomy of project development and tie the release of resources to those critical moments. So here's how that looked. The initial award was $10,000. That could be for you personally, that could go toward your project and production expenses. The second category was infrastructure support. This was up to $5,000. This could be used for your practice more generally. I loved this category. It helped people hire assistants, work with consultants, move their offices outside their homes, buy equipment, hire babysitters. But the most important thing it did was created the mind space for people to think about the things that they needed to stabilize their careers. Then there was, of course, more production and post-production support. That was up to about $20,000. It was available in increments, no more than about $10,000 at once, because we wanted every single creative capital dollar to leverage additional support. We had a category called special opportunities funding because we wanted people to be able to take advantage of things that might just come up that could really help advance their work. That was about $2,500. And then there was premier funding. This was also one of the great categories that we didn't understand enough about at the very beginning, but we added it from based on feedback from the artists. We held back about $7,500 for the project launch. And that was available following a stakeholder meeting, which brought the artists and the venue together to talk about goals for the project premiere. And then also what the venue was actually going to do. I used to call these meetings secretly a rendezvous with reality, because the artists were almost always disappointed with what they felt was too little that the venues were promising that they were going to provide. So our small financial commitment really made a difference. Artists use this money to create campaigns, to reach specific constituencies, to take out ads in publications, to hire their own PR people. I love talking about this component because this is something anybody can set up with a venue, with a premiering venue. You don't need a foundation as an intermediary. And then the final category, again, which we also learned a lot about from the artists, was expansion funding. And we held back that final $5,000 for the further life of the project. I think as we know, the impact of a lot of projects doesn't happen actually at the launch. It's in the further dissemination life of the project. And so we held back that $5,000 for websites and documentation or touring, particularly in the film world and the literary world. The distributors and publishers weren't that interested anymore in sending artists around once the internet came into being. So we were able to supply some support for artists to continue to do that. So that's really just the first component of the system. My suggestion is that when you start getting grants or investments, think through your project and parse the money out to yourself in a smart and sequential way. A couple of our grantees who got Guggenheims told me that they parsed that award out to themselves, modeled on the way we had parsed the Creative Capital grants out to them. That was kind of nice to hear. Perhaps the last step in the money trajectory, bringing things full circle, is that we had a payback clause in our contract. The board got rid of it after I left. It never really produced a lot of revenue for the organization, but I felt it was philosophically important because here's what it says. It says, if you were helped by us, you have the opportunity and the obligation to help the next generation. I sometimes jokingly referred to it as mandated generosity, but it felt, and it still feels to me, like an important part of the model. The second step, we supported the person beyond the specific project by helping artists build career skills. This was so important. We used an artist-centered, individualized approach to self-management and setting personal goals. We integrated career development work into the model right at the beginning. I came to Creative Capital with a long history, a lot of experience offering technical assistance to organizations. And I felt it was important to also help individual artists achieve a comfort level in the same kinds of areas, like PR and marketing and fundraising, project planning, negotiating, writing and speaking about your work in public, having a strong presence on the internet, crowdfunding, thinking well in advance of your project's premiere about community engagement strategies, putting a support team together. And then life skills. This was something I think that was a hallmark of our work. Life skills like strategic planning, which I also sometimes call life planning, learning how to manage not just project budgets, but your life budget as well. It's a long list, yes, but all of these professional and life skills are imperative for artists to have. In fact, in this particular moment, I would argue that these skills are more necessary than ever. And besides, how can you do your work in the world if you aren't taking care of yourself? How can you be a good partner to people working on your behalf if you don't have a basic understanding of what you're trying to achieve? We stopped talking about DIY early on, and we started talking about DIYWO, do it yourself with others. The skills building work was so powerful and transformative that we realized it didn't have to be limited to just our grantees. We created a national program with both in-person and online workshops, which had reached more than 15,000 people in more than 450 communities around the country by the time I left. And you know what? I learned a really important lesson about growth. Rather than grow in a predictable, linear way by supporting a small handful of additional artists with grants, we created a program that had much, much wider reach and much greater impact. The third component of the system is that we built the community of funded artists by nurturing relationships among grantees and between grantees and arts professionals. We did this through a mostly artist-only orientation and then a retreat that brought our awardees together with arts professionals. Once we notified artists that they'd received the grant, they were invited to a weekend-long orientation. There they met other grantees, the artist services staff, the artist advisor. We offered skills building workshops, and we began the process of helping people shape their project goals. Artist presentations are the heart of the retreat. We brought in dozens of people that I used to call the opportunity creators from all the different disciplines that we supported. Curators, programmers, festival directors, editors, publishers, exhibitors, other funders, and so on. We had each of the awardees make 7-minute presentations about their projects to the audience of their peers and the arts professionals who were there. Several hundred people were in attendance. We hired consultants to help the awardees make compelling presentations. And let me tell you, artists worked on their presentations for months. Most did not dare show up and just wing it. One artist described it after she'd been through it as the most important 7 minutes of your life. I don't know about that. There were many informal opportunities that we created for people to connect. I curated every dinner table at the retreat. I called it bar mitzvah seating. And then there were more formal opportunities for each artist to meet individually with 4 or 5 of the arts professionals that we'd assembled for meetings of about 20, 25 minutes each. I used to call this the biggest information swap meet in the history of the arts. And I could fill our Zoom today with the tangible outcomes of that event. And I know we have some former attendees in the audience, and maybe they will talk about the impact of that event on them. Several of you had questions about how to get noticed, how to get your work seen. And I would say take initiative. People really respect that. Create opportunities together and for each other. You know, a group event kind of takes the pressure off any single gallerist or collector or writer, or curator. So I think these group events are actually very smart. The last component of the system is that we engage the public through online promotion of the artists and their projects. We weren't a producer or presenter ourselves, so really we kind of functioned as an information broker. Obviously, the retreat played a big part in getting the word out about the artist projects. We did e-blast announcing premieres that went out to about 35,000 people at the time. We did an email newsletter periodically to that same group. And we also supported our artists through extensive social media outreach. So project, person, community, public. I considered this a designed system, even though I can honestly say that, as with venture capital, I didn't know doodly squat about design. Nonetheless, to my knowledge, there has never been such a comprehensive approach in our field. Shortly after our 10th birthday, we were so excited when the Harvard Business School decided to make us a case study. That had been one of my secret goals, so that validation really meant a lot. We definitely learned that the whole could be much greater than the sum of the parts as a result of this system at work. I'm going to give you just one example. We saw that our multifaceted approach could create what we started referring to as a chain of opportunity. We never knew in advance which individual element might set that chain in motion, which is why we believed so strongly in having a broad menu of options available to the artists. The perfect example of the chain at work is Brent Greene. Brent was a self-taught animator living in rural Pennsylvania at the time. He was about 26 when we funded him in 2005, and a perfect example of why having an open submission process can be so rewarding. I'll talk about that in a minute. No one would have ever nominated Brent because almost nobody knew about him. But his work was very appealing to our panelists, one of whom just happened to be Scott McCauley, who's still the editor of Filmmaker magazine. He included Brent in their much anticipated annual 25 to watch issue following the panel as #1 to watch. Brent then came to the Creative Capital Artist Retreat where he met Chris Doyle, one of our earlier grantees. Chris said, "You're going to be fine in your world, the indie film world, but you're a visual artist too, and you don't even know that yet. I'm going to fix you up in my world." A very generous act. Brent had a sold-out show at a Chelsea gallery. He was invited to do a solo sculpture show at the Cleveland Sculpture Center. Annie Philbin, your wonderful director of the Hammer Museum, saw him present at a Creative Capital event in New York, and he was invited to the project room at the Hammer. He's been to Sundance numerous times, including to the Screenwriters Lab, and he was the subject of a 10-page article in Art in America in 2011. Brent has said publicly, "Creative Capital single-handedly gave me a career." Now, this is an extreme example, but it's a good example, I think, of what can happen. So I really believe in this holistic approach. Over time, we began to see that our early support of a project often helped artists to leverage additional resources. In fact, right before I left, a study we commissioned showed that our $40 million commitment, which was referred to in the intro, had helped grantees leverage an additional nearly $100 million. So in spite of the early skepticism, the methodology proved quite durable. And I now see this comprehensive approach as a success methodology. That's how I talk about it. Not that it guarantees success, nothing can do that, but it creates an environment that encourages success as artists themselves choose to define it. And that is very different definition, artist to artist. We saw artists as entrepreneurs in the cultural arena. This was a radical idea 20 years ago. And we believed that they deserved access to tools, information, and relationships that paralleled what was available to entrepreneurs in other sectors. Of course, we differed from venture capital in, of course, critical ways. Obviously, money was not a motivating factor for us in selecting a project, but potential for cultural impact was a criterion. And this is where the inspiration and values from more community-centered entities kicked in. Unlike venture capital, we never really developed an exit strategy for our artists because each relationship was individualized to suit the artist's best interest. And truthfully, no one was leaving. Nobody was going anywhere. So instead of thinking of that as a liability, we began to understand what an incredible asset that was. We began to consider artists who had completed their projects as alums, and we continue to offer a select number of services to them, including a low-interest loan fund, continued access to professional services, help and resources if they wanted to host gatherings for members of the Creative Capital community, and most importantly, the opportunity to be paid to mentor new cohorts of artists. They also served as selection panelists and board members. A number of our grantees had inspiring successes, and while I would love to claim that that was solely because of our brilliant approach, of course that isn't true. I don't believe that what we put in place would have worked if we hadn't selected such extraordinary artists. In truth, creative capital represents a structured intervention into the lives and careers of enormously talented people. So I thought I might pull back the curtain a bit on how our selection process worked when I was there. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail because things have changed. And if you're thinking about applying, and there is a deadline coming up, I think it's March 1st, the website will be the best place to look for current information. And I know that they do info sessions as we did. And so you can get probably most of your questions answered there. But I wanted to give you a window into what was in our minds at the beginning. One important commitment we made right at the beginning was to an open submission process. We were one of only a handful of national funders that offered an open application. Everybody told me I was crazy not to use a nomination system, and there's nothing wrong with nomination, that's a fine approach, but to me it felt anti-democratic. I wanted to feel that anybody with a compelling idea could have a shot. I had spent many years serving on many National Endowment for the Arts panels, and there was always something glorious about knowing that anybody with an idea could apply. I wanted to mirror public sector values in the private enterprise space, to be a home for the most compelling and possibly even wildest ideas. One of my favorite things a Creative Capital grantee ever said to me was, he felt that most creative capital projects have an air of the impossible about them. We were looking for artists who demonstrated bold, inventive, and singular ideas in both form and content, who were at a catalytic moment in their creative practices and in their approach to their careers, were deeply engaged and rigorously committed to their art forms, had potential for significant artistic and cultural impact, and understood the professional landscape of their fields. We got several thousand applications every year. At each stage, we asked our evaluators to look for the artistic strength, the vision, the originality, and the potential for impact of the proposed project, the professional capacity of the applicant and the feasibility of the project, and the potential benefit of our support, particularly the non-monetary aspects of the program. We had evaluators score all the proposals that they read and then to rank their top choices. And then, and I will tell you, in the early years, we weren't getting this. So we realized that we had to operationalize risk-taking. We didn't know we were going to have to do that, but we did. We asked all the evaluators to include 2 wildcards in the mix. I'll tell you what was interesting about that. My last year, I think it was 16 or 18 of the 46 projects eventually awarded had been wildcards at some point in the process. I'm really proud of that. The questions on the application were deceptive. They seem simple on the one hand, but they're definitely revealing. I know that our application has been used a lot in professional practices classes around the country. That was really gratifying to learn. And I was often asked as I traveled around, why should I apply when the process is so competitive? And I think this is what I'm going to say is true not just for Creative Capital, but for other processes as well. You know, we worked hard to build value into the entire process, even if you didn't get a Creative Capital award. The application form itself was designed to help artists better articulate their project and goals and to position themselves in their field. So many people came up to me at conferences and said, I didn't get the grant, but I learned so much about my project just from completing the application. In the first round, evaluation round, 2 people from your field read about your project. And one of those was probably somebody from your region. We did that very intentionally. We felt that if there's somebody from your region who doesn't know about your work, wow, we get to introduce your work to somebody who might be in a position in your region to help you. If you made it all the way to the panel, a total of somewhere between 9 and 11 people in your field will have been informed about your project, even if you didn't get a grant. These are exactly the kinds of people with whom you would want to be sharing your portfolio. I can't begin to tell you how many times people said to us, panelists said to us, or evaluators said to us, you know, I just read this phenomenal proposal, and frankly, I don't really care whether you guys give it a grant or not. Is it okay to call the artist and tell them I'm interested? And we were like, absolutely. And they would say, well, I won't tell them where I saw it. We were like, tell them where you saw it. That lets people know that there's a value in applying. Further, recognizing that we were in this privileged position of receiving so many more terrific proposals than we could possibly fund, we created On Our Radar. It was something I'd wanted to do from the very beginning, and finally the technology made it a lot more feasible. We posted projects that had made it through a couple of grant rounds but weren't ultimately selected. And we promoted On Our Radar to our entire mailing list. And we saw that process On Our Radar created opportunities for artists that we ourselves weren't able to support. I often suggest to artists, apply for anything that you are eligible for. You get better and better at talking about your work. It's good practice. If you haven't written a grant proposal ever before, I think the Creative Capital application is probably a pretty good place to start. But again, there's some people in the audience who maybe can provide other resources too. So what did we learn over 17 years? Relative to the program, I learned that this is not a good grant for everyone. Of course, you want what you're doing to be great for everybody, but it just wasn't. Much like the relationship between a venture capital firm and a new venture, it's pretty demanding of the artist. We expected a high level of engagement. So I used to say it could be like being in a relationship with a high maintenance spouse, and that's not really great for everyone. People who really just need the money to fill out a budget and will just move on to the next project and the next, they're not generally helped by this approach. So who does benefit? Artists who are poised to take advantage of a potentially catalytic relationship, who are at a catalytic moment in their careers. At the beginning, we weren't sure whether this would turn out to be a grant that worked better for mid-career artists, emerging artists, or established artists. We just didn't know. But it turned out that the utility of the grant had nothing to do with where someone was in their career. It only had to do with whether they were at that catalytic moment and whether they had a real interest in engaging with us. And we're sort of, when I say us, we're sort of a proxy for kind of engaging with their careers. Our age range of our grantees at the time of funding was from 25 to 80. We learned that the earlier we could come into a project, the more helpful we could be. It's really difficult to have much impact on a project that's just about finished. We often encouraged people to slow down, and people really appreciated that. And we really, really learned the value of small money at the right moment. Sometimes if you miss the moment, and maybe you've had this experience in your life, even a lot of money won't solve the problem. This means that you have to stay alert and poised to take advantage of opportunities as they arise. So those are some of the things that I think that we learned through the program. But organizationally, beyond the program itself, I think I learned that every organization, really every entity now, needs to be a permanent laboratory in constant re-envisioning and response mode. That realization led me to start obsessively thinking about the future and how what is being predicted about the future should be influencing probably more than it is. It should be having greater influence on how we think about our work and our organizations going forward. The first concept you encounter when you begin this research is that change is now a constant. I'm not sure we will ever feel stable again. I was already feeling this way, and maybe you were too, before the pandemic. I've read that we will experience more change in the next 20 years than we have in the last 300. It's not just the fact of change that we have to contend with. Ours is a world of near constant discontinuity, I read in the book No Ordinary Disruption. As fast as innovation has multiplied and spread in recent years, it's poised to change and grow at an exponential speed beyond the power of human intuition to anticipate. I'm just going to say that again. Beyond the power of human intuition to anticipate. That is a staggering phrase. The futurist Gerd Leonhard wrote in 2016 that global digital transformation was bringing about an age of digitalations, digitization, screenification, automation, virtualization, and I'll add a word that I learned at a futurist conference because I started going to things like that, taskification. That's what were formerly known as jobs, which raised the question of what it means to be human in a digitally transformed future. He predicted, without knowing a pandemic was coming, that, quote, the nature of people's interactions with each other would change, and that, quote, everything that can become digital will indeed become digital. Hello, 2020. Think about this. It took 50 years after the telephone was invented until half of American homes had one. Just half after 50 years. By contrast, Apple has sold more than 2.2 billion iPhones globally since it was released in 2007, just 13 years ago. The iPhone App Store launched in 2008 with 500 apps. Today, there are 1.8 million apps. Facebook attracted 6 million users in its first year and now has more than 2.7 billion users monthly. That doesn't even take into account the things that are here or almost here, like developments in robotics. I hope you've seen the dancing robots that Boston Dynamics have launched into the world. Please don't go there now. I'm still talking, but at the end, I suggest that you look at the dancing robot. You'll be delighted, amazed, and terrified. That was a collaboration with the choreographer Monica Thomas. Biological breakthroughs like 24/7 healthcare monitoring, printing body parts on a 3D printer, space tourism, life on Mars, on and on. Are we hardwired as a species for this degree of change? You're more hardwired for change than my generation, but are you ready for what feels like near daily change, especially now? How will we navigate these massive shifts in an operational sense, but also personally, emotionally? There's a phenomenon called recency bias, where we intuitively believe and want the future to look roughly like the immediate past. It's comforting, and this is why we can be slow to adapt to change. Right now, we have a deep desire to get back to normal. I don't think we're going to have this luxury. The new normal could be barely recognizable. Leonhard suggests that the future will be about how we manage maintaining our humanness in a technologized world. Reporting for duty. This will be our job. What could and should be our place as artists and cultural workers in a future of flux? Of course, there will be many challenges, but what are our opportunities to ensure a human and humane, just, and equitable future? What are the personal qualities that we'll need to cultivate to thrive? Clearly, if change is a constant, the central quality we will all need is flexibility and adaptability, a joyful willingness to adjust as the external environment shifts. I think about how fast education had to morph. I was teaching at the New School during the spring semester last year. Varying degrees of success and a lot of grumbling once we understood the impact of the pandemic. But we'll need curiosity. We will need to dwell in a state of what I call extreme alertness. We'll need to be ceaselessly experimental and risk-taking. We'll all need good analytical skills and the ability to synthesize. We will all need to be lifelong students. We have to bake the notion of change into ourselves and our organizations, our businesses, our educational institutions. We have to create ethical frameworks and make a lasting commitment to equity and justice. We will need to rethink our addiction to growth so that we can live again joyously within the limits of the planet. In his book, The Age of the Unthinkable, a book about our foreign policy challenges, Joshua Cooper Ramo, a former editor at Time magazine, wrote that there are forces for change at work that are invisible using old ways of seeing. He says that the source of the greatest historical disasters is that so few people at the time either recognize or understand the shift. And then listen to what his next sentence was in a book about foreign policy. Here's the next sentence. Artists, he wrote, with their tuned instincts for the new, often do. If he's right, and of course, I think he is, it makes the support for and the validation and recognition of contemporary artists not a luxury to be left to the vagaries of a commercial marketplace, but rather a societal imperative. I think about how much Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem meant to so many of us. I suspect that it's her words from that day that will resonate long into the future. Poetry was revealed as necessary. And it's a perfect illustration of why artists need to be a more integral part of larger conversations. James Baldwin wrote, everybody wants an artist on the wall or on the library shelf, but nobody wants one in the house. But we need you in the house. The artist Joseph Beuys, I'm sure you've studied him, talked about social sculpture, the idea that society itself is a great work of art and we're all called upon to participate in it and transform it and reshape it. The architect and designer Bruce Mau talks about how he lost interest in the world of design, but became entranced by the prospect of designing the world. These are such great metaphors, whether you're building a world-changing business, launching a social enterprise, or creating an art project. I used to say that creative capital was my conceptual art project. What would the world look like if all our governmental systems, our businesses, our nonprofit organizations thought of themselves this way? It could be a kind of exciting world. We so need artists with your ability to come at problems from unexpected perspectives and with your fearlessness to be not only central players in the complex world that we currently inhabit, but to be compassionate tour guides to what can feel like an uncertain and scary future. Perhaps most important, we need you to be part of the team of Imagineers and inventors of a future that is more equitable and just, that is brighter, not just for a small group of people, but for everyone. And we need you to facilitate not only your own creative voice, but the creative voices of others. So this is the charge that I want to issue to each of us today. Working with our neighbors, with our colleagues, with each other, let's build the future that we want to live in. Thank you.
Ruby, thank you so much. That was such a powerful talk. We have some time now, about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Anyone's welcome to put a question into the Q&A. While we let the attendees mull on all of the rich information that's been presented so far, I wonder if one of our students, Lauren or Highway, do you have a question or comment that you'd like to start for Ruby?
Thank you, Ruby. That was incredible. I think Highway may have dropped off. Maybe she has internet issues. I'm not sure. But yeah, I have a question for you. What really stuck with me was this catalyst moment, this catalytic moment that you described, and just kind of addressing maybe the other MAs and MFAs in our program. Do you feel like we're in a position where we can like cultivate this catalytic moment now? And do you have any advice or comments about creating that moment?
You know, this is something that I've thought a lot about, and I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I think that there's some periods that artists go through where they really do just need to be making work, and they don't need to be also, you know, self-critical and up in their own heads. And then there are other moments where I think they need, you know, there's an opportunity often to step back and think about, whoa, wait, what am I doing here? Am I just repeating myself? Am I, you know, am I really moving my work forward? Am I just satisfying, you know, some preconceived notion of what I think I should be doing? When somebody is asking those kinds of questions, what we found is that was the perfect moment for us to enter a practice. And people, you know, were very vulnerable and revealing sometimes in their applications. I remember really prominent, like a pioneer. I mean, someone who was a video art pioneer, saying, you know, people think when you get to this point in your career, you know, she basically said, I am a video art pioneer. People think when you get to this point in your career that you have everything figured out. And she said, I'm here to tell you I don't. I really need help. Wow. Okay, who's not going to fund that proposal? You know, so of course she got a grant. We had another artist. People were at first very confused about why we had supported her. She was a very well-known artist, very established, had a strong commercial career. She had already gotten a MacArthur Genius Grant. But wow, what she was trying to do was actually make a leap from her visual arts life to a performing arts life. And you're like, oh my God, this is an amazing artist. How would we not want to be on this journey with her? So again, that's not every moment in every career, right? There are these certain times, I think, when an intervention actually can be really helpful. And that doesn't have to be a specific grant or money. It can actually be just conversations with your friends, you know?
Yeah. Wow, that's really incredible to hear, just this moment that we're in as students. So I wish Highway could jump back on. I know she has questions for you, and I know that our class also has questions for you later on. So
I see we have a question here in the Q&A from Nicholas. And the question is about what kinds of projects Creative Capital would fund. So I know that you spoke about Creative Capital from a past experience rather than present, and you did qualify your talk by saying that you could only speak from past experience. And I think perhaps the question is a little bit specific about the work that this artist is making, but I think what might be a useful approach to this question would be to say, aside from the point of career development of the artist, was there a scale of ambition, a type of engagement, a relationship to the public that Creative Capital might have given priority to, or some other criteria around the form or the approach of the artwork?
Yeah, I think that we were really, I think, as I said, we were looking for people who were sort of singular in their fields, people whose work really didn't look like anybody else's. And I think ambition was a huge thing that we were looking for. We were looking for people who were sort of, you know, I think willing to go beyond, you know, their comfort zone, and to try to reach a new place. And I think, you know, in many cases, there were people who had a lot to back up, you know, their new ventures. So we had a lot of confidence that they were serious, and that they would, you know, do, you know, that they would really do their best to try to move forward. So I would say we were looking for ambition. We were looking for singularity. I mean, I had this vision of every single project as almost like its own little satellite out in the universe, and we then could bring them all together to create a community of really extraordinary work. And I think we did. You know, we were one of the really first, I would say, funders to support technology-based artists. I created a category called emerging fields right at the beginning, because I thought, you know, if you're supporting contemporary art, you know, you don't know where artists might take you, right? So maybe they're not going to, you know, these artists who are exploring other things, maybe they're not going to feel comfortable in a performing arts category or a visual arts category or a documentary film category. We wanted to create a home for people who were taking risks in brand new fields. You know, 20 years ago, social practice work wasn't that, you know, wasn't that in that much currency, right? So we ended up supporting a lot of that work very early on. That was an interesting kind of relationship in the emerging fields category of sort of both social practice work and technology-based work. That was kind of interesting. So I think really we were looking for singular voices, and for the confidence that people could realize ambitious ideas.
Wonderful. Do we have any more questions from the group?
Hi, I think I can jump on with one more question. I apologize for my technical difficulties, but thank you so much. That was such a wonderful talk, and it was so inspiring to hear your thoughts about the past and also the future of the arts. So I'm curious about you. Well, you're so attuned also, I think, with the creative process and with what artists' struggles are. And I just, by saying that time is so essential and giving them time and space to make their work, I mean, I think that's very crucial, but something that people arts institutions often don't attend to, right? So, and I also was very struck by your comment that the questions on the application were seemingly really simple, but also made the artists really think and reflect. And I feel like those are always the best kinds of questions, right? So I guess I'm wondering for our students, especially in curatorial studies, what advice you might give to them about how they should talk to artists, what kinds of questions they should be asking them to try to help further along their careers on both sides. Thank you.
Well, yeah, so that's a great question. So I think one thing is that we found was challenging was, and I mentioned this in the workshop too, is to get people to speak about their work in plain language. I used to say in our info sessions, if you use the word simulacra, you're probably not going to get a creative capital grant. So I think purging the the jargon from the art jargon from your presentations about your work or your articulations about your work is a big first step. And in fact, having conversations with artists where you can say, stop. Most people are not going to know what you're talking about. I think, Joe Biden said, if you're going to put something in writing, call your mom or your aunt and find out if they know what the heck you're talking about. I think that's really good advice. So you can challenge people on the ways that they're talking about their work. That is a gift, right? I think one thing that we did that I mentioned, we hired people to come in and work with our artists to do verbal presentations. That was one of the best expenditures of money we made because people got really good. I remember early on, we had a couple of artists and they were just so snotty. They were like, well, I can't possibly do a 7-minute presentation. I'm sorry. I have never spoken for under 25 minutes, or, whatever. We're like, well, there are a lot of people here today, a lot of artists. You're not the only one here, and you're going to have to speak for 7 minutes, and we will cut you off and we will get you off the stage. So 7 minutes it is. That same artist came up to me after the presentation. He said, I'm never going to do a presentation longer than 7 minutes ever again. And so we learned that you can essentialize, right? And so, yes, you need to be able to do a good academic presentation. You need to be able to have an elevator pitch, right? So that you can tell somebody quickly what you're doing. And you need that good 5 to 7 minute presentation as well. I think that's something else that curators could help with. One of the questions that we asked also that I think is one of the best questions well, there are a couple of questions that are really great, but one was to situate yourself, your practice, right? To situate yourself within your field. Or what are the influences on you, like from outside your field? Sometimes people are influenced by an environmentalist or a philosopher or they weren't necessarily, their influences were not necessarily coming from the art world. And that was super interesting to know. And so I think helping artists, again, articulate and be honest about what's feeding them, what is making them passionate about the work that they're doing is something that can also be extremely helpful.
We have a question from Suzanne Lacey. She asks, she'd like to hear your thoughts about how important it is for artists to understand larger social themes, such as your focus on understanding the future.
Look, artists are not living in, holes underground. I mean, we are living in the world as it is evolving, and hopefully as we can help to shape it. So I don't think anything is more important than that. I have to confess that the work that I'm doing now, I'm on a lot of boards and advisory boards, and the thing I'm the most excited about right now is the Center for Artistic Activism, which funded artists to do projects and make some amazing projects around voter suppression before the last election, and I think they'll really dig in. I'm more interested in that kind of work now, just personally, than I am. Again, this is personal. With than I am with seeing a great painting on a wall. Which is not to say I don't like to see great paintings on a wall, but just where I want to put my personal energy right now is into that end of the cultural field. And so I think it's a tremendous responsibility.
Thank you. And then we have a comment from Suda House. Thank you for your presentation and life investment in the arts. I want to commend you on the open call. There are so many creative image makers doing amazing projects, and recognizing them through a democratic process and keeping it down to earth. So thank you for your comment, Suda. I think that might be a great note for us to end on. Any more parting wisdom for us?
No, I think that's, I'm talked out 4 hours of my voice. I'm lucky I still have one. I can't tell you how wonderful it has been to be with you today and the entire day, and to meet the students. It's been just a real joy. I don't know, I have one thing. Is Edgar Arsenault here? Can you tell if he's here? I know he was going to try to come.
I don't see Edgar, but I'm sure he'll watch the video. So you could leave him a message and he'll get it perhaps asynchronously.
Oh, I really wanted to get his thoughts on the whole process, because he was pretty engaged for a long time, and he was one of our artist advisors, and I think he's on the board now. So he sort of has had the full sweep of the organizational experience. So he's a good person to comment.
Great. Well, fortunately, many of our attendees are students in our program, so they have access to Edgar. So make sure that if you're thinking about applying to Creative Capital, that you bend his ear, try to find out as much as you can. Also, Suzanne Lacey obviously has a lot of experience working with you, Ruby. So what a great treasure. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your wisdom today. We know you're exhausted, but join us for the last bit in the seminar, and I'm sure the students will entertain you.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.